My daughter's teacher assaulted her. Then I discovered something worse. The silent scream. The rain fell heavily on that Tuesday afternoon in late September. Amara Jackson sat in her office at the Metro Daily News, reviewing notes for her next investigative piece, when her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter's school. Simone has requested to be picked up. Please call the school immediately. Amara's stomach tightened. Simone had never asked to be picked up early. In her 14 years of life, Simone Jackson had been the kind of daughter that every parent dreamed of. Straight-A student, never missed a day of school, planned to attend an Ivy League university. She was responsible, mature for her age, and deeply engaged in her education. Something was terribly wrong. Amara grabbed her bag and rushed out of the office. The 15-minute drive to Lincoln High School felt like an hour. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had Simone been in an accident? Was she sick? Had something happened at school? When Amara arrived at the school, she found Simone sitting in the nurse's office, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm classroom. Her daughter's face was pale. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Her entire body was trembling. "Baby, what happened?" Amara rushed to her daughter's side. Simone couldn't answer. She just shook her head and began crying harder. The school nurse, Mrs. Patricia Patterson, approached Amara with a concerned expression. "We found your daughter in the hallway around 2 p.m., Mrs. Patterson explained. She was having difficulty walking. When we asked if she was okay, she became very distressed. We called her to the nurse's office, gave her some water and a blanket. We wanted to call you immediately, but she asked us to wait a few minutes before contacting you." Amara knelt down in front of her daughter. "Simone, honey, I need you to tell me what happened. Are you hurt?" Simone looked at her mother, and the fear in her eyes was unlike anything Amara had ever seen before. It was the look of someone who had experienced a violation so profound that the world itself had become unsafe. It was the look of someone whose childhood had been stolen. "Can we just go home?" Simone whispered. "Please?" The drive home was silent. Simone stared out the window, occasionally wiping tears from her face. When they arrived home, Amara suggested they sit down and talk, but Simone just shook her head and went upstairs to her room. Amara stood in the kitchen, her mind spiraling with worry. She poured herself a cup of coffee and waited. She had learned through her years as a journalist that sometimes people needed time before they could talk about trauma. Pushing too hard, too fast, could backfire. An hour later, Simone came downstairs. She was wearing one of her father's old sweatshirts. Amara's ex-husband, Michael, had passed away 3 years earlier from a heart attack. Simone often wore his clothes when she was upset, as if his presence could comfort her. "I need to tell you something," Simone said quietly, sitting down at the kitchen table. And then, slowly and carefully, with long pauses and difficult words that took nearly an hour to get out, Simone told her mother what had happened. Mr. James Thomas had been tutoring Simone in geometry since the beginning of the school year. He was considered one of the school's best teachers, well-liked by students, respected by colleagues, known for his ability to help struggling students improve their grades. Simone's math skills were strong, but she wanted to get an A in the class rather than settle for the B+ she was getting, so she had asked for tutoring. Mr. Thomas had agreed. The tutoring sessions were supposed to happen after school, in his classroom, for 1 hour twice a week. The first few sessions, nothing unusual happened. Mr. Thomas would explain concepts that Simone didn't understand. They would work through problems together. He would answer her questions. It was professional and appropriate. Simone felt comfortable and appreciated having a teacher who took such care with her education. But gradually, things began to change. Mr. Thomas started making comments about Simone's appearance. He told her she was beautiful. He told her she was special. He told her that she reminded him of his daughter, who was close to Simone's age. He told her that she was his favorite student. He told her that she had a special maturity for her age. These comments made Simone uncomfortable, but she didn't know how to respond. Mr. Thomas was an adult. He was a teacher. He was supposed to be trustworthy. Maybe this was normal? Maybe she was being oversensitive? Then he started finding reasons to touch her. He would put his hand on her shoulder while explaining a concept. He would brush against her while walking past her desk. He would put his hand on her back while looking at her homework. He would adjust her posture while she was working on problems. The touches were subtle enough that Simone wasn't sure if they were intentional or accidental, but they made her increasingly uncomfortable. Simone had tried to avoid the tutoring sessions. She had made excuses. She had said she had other obligations. She had even told her mother she didn't need tutoring anymore. But Mr. Thomas had insisted that they continue. He said her grade would suffer if they stopped. He said he was committed to helping her succeed. He said she was his star student and he couldn't let her down. Simone felt trapped. How could she refuse her teacher? How could she explain to her mother that she felt uncomfortable without sounding ungrateful? And then, 3 weeks ago, during what was supposed to be a regular tutoring session after school, everything changed. It was a Friday afternoon. The school hallways were nearly empty. Most students had gone home. Mr. Thomas told Simone to come to his classroom for their tutoring session. When Simone arrived, Mr. Thomas locked the classroom door. Simone asked him why he had locked the door. Her voice was already uncertain. "Mr. Thomas, why did you lock it?" He said it was to avoid distractions. He said he didn't want other students wandering in. He said he wanted to make sure they wouldn't be interrupted. Then he moved closer to her. "You're so beautiful, Simone," he said. "I've been thinking about you a lot. I know this is probably confusing, but I wanted you to know that I care about you. In a special way." Simone froze. She didn't understand what was happening. She didn't understand what Mr. Thomas meant by special way. She was 14 years old. She was in his classroom. This was her teacher. Mr. Thomas took her silence as consent. He moved behind her and put his hands on her shoulders. Then he turned her around to face him. She tried to back away, but he pulled her toward him. "It's okay," he said. "You trust me, don't you? You know I would never hurt you." Simone tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. She was frozen with fear and confusion. Her body wasn't responding the way she wanted it to. She felt paralyzed. Mr. Thomas began touching her in ways that made her feel sick. He put his hands places that should never be touched by an adult in a position of authority over her. He removed part of her clothing. He made sounds that frightened her. He whispered things in her ear about how she wanted this, about how she had been coming on to him, about how if she told anyone, no one would believe her because he was a respected teacher, and she was just a student. The assault lasted approximately 20 minutes, though to Simone it felt like hours. Time became distorted. Her mind seemed to separate from her body. She stopped trying to resist because she realized that resistance wasn't working. When it was over, Mr. Thomas told her to get dressed. He told her that what had just happened was a sign of how much he cared about her. He told her that she should feel special. He told her that she was the one who had initiated this. He told her that she had wanted it, even though she clearly hadn't. He told her that if she told anyone what had happened, he would deny it and everyone would believe him instead of her. He told her that he would fail her in the class and ruin her college prospects. He told her that she would ruin his life and the lives of his family if she said anything. He told her that the police wouldn't believe her. He told her that her mother wouldn't believe her. He told her she was responsible for keeping his secret. Then he unlocked the classroom door and acted like nothing had happened. "Same time next week?" he said as she left, as if they had just finished a normal tutoring session. Simone walked out in a daze. She made it to the hallway before the full reality of what had happened crashed down on her. She couldn't breathe. Her heart was racing so fast she thought it might explode. Her entire body felt wrong. Her skin felt like it belonged to someone else. She didn't know where to go or what to do. She just stood in the hallway trying not to scream. That's where Mrs. Patterson found her. The day after Simone came home from school, Amara called Lincoln High School and requested a meeting with Principal David Harrison. "This is regarding a serious matter involving my daughter and one of your teachers," Amara said when the secretary asked for details about the meeting. She got an appointment for the following day. Amara brought Simone with her. She also brought her phone, on which she had recorded all of Simone's account of what happened, with Simone's permission. She wasn't a lawyer, but she knew enough about legal procedure to understand that documentation was important. When they arrived at Principal Harrison's office, Amara was struck by how sterile it was. The office smelled like old coffee and cheap air freshener. There were several plaques on the wall celebrating the school's achievements. One plaque boasted that Lincoln High had the lowest expulsion rate in the district. Another noted that the school had received an award for school safety. The irony was not lost on Amara. Principal David Harrison was a man in his mid-50s, tall and thin, with graying hair, and the kind of permanent slight smile that suggested he rarely took anything seriously. He wore an expensive suit and had the confident bearing of someone who had never been held accountable for anything. He gestured for Amara and Simone to sit in the uncomfortable plastic chairs across from his desk. "Ms. Jackson, thank you for coming in," Principal Harrison began. "I understand you have some concerns about one of our teachers?" "My daughter was sexually assaulted by Mr. James Thomas," Amara said directly, her voice steady but trembling with controlled rage. "She reported it to the school nurse, and we're here to report it to you as the principal." Principal Harrison's expression didn't change. He maintained his slight smile. "I'm very sorry to hear that," he said. "But before we proceed, I should tell you that I'm not able to discuss specific personnel matters without following proper procedures. I'll need to notify our superintendent and our human resources department. This will likely trigger an investigation." "Good," Amara said. "I want this investigated." "Of course," Principal Harrison said, "but I want to manage your expectations here. Investigations like this can take time. We need to interview all parties involved. We need to preserve evidence. We need to make sure we follow the law." He paused, folding his hands together on his desk in a gesture that seemed calculated to appear thoughtful. "I also want to tell you that Mr. Thomas has been a teacher at this school for 15 years. He has an excellent record. He's beloved by students and colleagues. Parents often request him specifically to teach their children. This is a serious allegation, and I take it seriously, but I also want to be careful not to destroy a good man's reputation based on an accusation." Amara felt her jaw clench. She looked at Simone, who was staring at the floor, trembling. She could see her daughter's hands clenching and unclenching in her lap. "My daughter has bruises on her arms," Amara said, her voice rising with controlled fury. "She was hospitalized yesterday for a panic attack. She has described specific details about what happened. This isn't just an accusation. This is an account of assault." "I understand," Principal Harrison said, "and we will investigate thoroughly. But I do want to mention that bruises can come from a variety of sources, and emotional distress, while concerning, is not necessarily proof of inappropriate conduct." Amara wanted to throw the plastic chair at him. Instead, she took a deep breath and continued. "When will this investigation be complete?" she asked. "That depends on the investigation," Principal Harrison said. "These things typically take 2 to 4 weeks. We need to be thorough." "And in the meantime," Amara asked, her voice cold, "what happens to my daughter's safety? What prevents Mr. Thomas from accessing her again?" "Well," Principal Harrison said, "as part of our investigation, Mr. Thomas will be made aware of the allegations. He'll have an opportunity to respond. But in the interest of ensuring fairness to all parties, I don't think we should remove him from his position based solely on an unsubstantiated claim." "Unsubstantiated?" Amara felt her voice rising. "My daughter came home traumatized. She's been assaulted by an adult in a position of authority. She has bruises. She had a panic attack. She has identified the location, the time, what he was wearing, what he did to her. How is any of that unsubstantiated? I understand your frustration, Principal Harrison said, and his calm tone made everything worse. It made Amara realize that he genuinely didn't see her daughter's assault as important. But we need to be thorough and fair. Removing a teacher from his position is a serious matter. We need to follow due process. Due process for the teacher? Amara asked. What about due process for my daughter? What about her right to safety? That's why we're conducting an investigation, Principal Harrison said. Once the investigation is complete, if we find sufficient evidence of wrongdoing, we will take appropriate action. Amara realized she was getting nowhere. She decided to try a different approach. Has Mr. Thomas had any other complaints filed against him? She asked. Principal Harrison hesitated. It was just a brief pause, but Amara caught it. In her years as an investigative journalist, she had learned to recognize that pause, the moment when someone is deciding whether to tell the truth or protect themselves. I can't discuss other personnel matters, Principal Harrison said. That information is confidential. So there are other complaints, Amara said. It wasn't a question. I didn't say that, Principal Harrison replied. But you also didn't deny it, Amara said, which tells me everything I need to know. The meeting ended shortly after that. Principal Harrison assured Amara that the investigation would be conducted thoroughly and fairly. He advised her to have her daughter speak with the school counselor to process the trauma. He suggested that the family might benefit from therapy. He did not offer to remove Mr. Thomas from his position. He did not offer to keep him away from students. He did not offer to suspend him pending the outcome of the investigation. He did not express genuine concern for Simone's well-being. As Amara and Simone left the office, Principal Harrison called out behind them, Ms. Jackson, I would advise you to be very careful about making accusations like this. Mr. Thomas's family is considering legal action against you for defamation. I would suggest consulting with an attorney before you go public with these allegations. Amara turned back to look at him. You're threatening me, she asked. I'm advising you, Principal Harrison said, for your own protection. Amara and her daughter left the school in silence. In the car, Simone began crying again. She was terrified. Not only had her teacher assaulted her, but the school had essentially told them that they would protect him instead of her. The system had failed her before she even had a chance to seek justice. That night, Amara filed a formal complaint with the police department. A detective named Robert Chen was assigned to the case. He called her the next day to arrange an interview. Detective Chen met with Amara and Simone at the police station. He was a middle-aged man with a tired expression that suggested he had seen too much. He interviewed Simone for 45 minutes, taking detailed notes. He interviewed Amara for another 30 minutes. He told them that he would investigate the matter. 2 weeks later, Detective Chen called Amara with the news. I'm sorry, he said, but we've determined that there isn't sufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges at this time. It's your daughter's word against his, and without corroborating physical evidence or witnesses, we don't have enough to proceed. Amara felt the anger rising again, but she pushed it down. She had another idea. Did you interview Mr. Thomas? She asked. Yes, of course, Detective Chen said. He denies the allegations. He says your daughter came to his classroom for tutoring, as she often did, and that nothing inappropriate occurred. He says he was alone with her, yes, but that he did nothing beyond helping her with her algebra homework. Did you investigate his employment history? Amara asked. We obtained his personnel file from the school, Detective Chen said. It shows he's been an employee for 15 years with no complaints. Amara knew that wasn't true. She had already discovered that there were multiple complaints. What about his background before he became a teacher? She asked. His background check came back clean, Detective Chen said. No criminal history. Did you contact his previous employers? Amara asked. Not in detail, Detective Chen said. We reviewed his background check, which is standard. Amara realized that Detective Chen had done a cursory investigation at best. He hadn't followed up. He hadn't dug deeper. He had interviewed the teacher, found his denial, and decided there wasn't enough evidence to proceed. The system had failed her again, but Amara was not going to accept this. As an investigative journalist, she had access to public records. She filed a formal public records request for any and all complaints that had been filed against James Thomas in the past 10 years. The response, when it came 3 weeks later, was shocking. There were 7 complaints. 7 different students going back 15 years had accused James Thomas of inappropriate behavior. Some had accused him of making inappropriate comments. Some had accused him of unwanted touching. Some had accused him of sexual assault. The school's response to every single one of those complaints had been the same: investigation inconclusive, allegations unsubstantiated, teacher retained, 7 students, 15 years, no consequences. The school had been protecting a sexual predator for over a decade. Amara's rage became focused and weaponized. This wasn't just about her daughter anymore. This was about a pattern. This was about an institution that had known about a predator and had chosen to protect him. This was about 7 girls whose complaints had been ignored. She decided right then that she was going to expose James Thomas, Principal Harrison, and everyone else who had participated in the cover-up. She was going to use every skill she had learned in 20 years of investigative journalism to bring them to justice. The first victim she found was named Keisha Williams. Amara found her through an alumni database from the school. According to records, Keisha had graduated 9 years earlier. Amara conducted a careful online search and found her name connected to a social worker organization in the city. She called the organization and left a message explaining that she was a journalist investigating a teacher at Lincoln High School and would like to speak with Keisha about her experience. Keisha called her back 3 days later. "I don't know if I want to do this," Keisha said when they first spoke on the phone. "It's been 9 years. I've worked really hard to move past what happened." "I understand," Amara said, "and I won't pressure you, but I'm investigating James Thomas. I've found evidence that he's assaulted at least 7 students. One of them is my daughter. I believe that coming forward could help protect other children from him." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "Okay," Keisha finally said. "I'll talk to you, but I want to do it in person, somewhere safe, somewhere I feel comfortable." They met at a coffee shop the following Saturday. Keisha was a young woman in her mid-20s, professional and put together, but Amara could see the pain behind her eyes. "He told me I was special," Keisha said after ordering her coffee and finding a quiet corner table. "I was 16 years old and he told me that I was the only student he had ever felt a real connection with. He told me that what was happening between us was different, that it was a real relationship." She paused, her hands trembling slightly as she held her coffee cup. "I believed him. I was 16 years old and I believed him. He was an adult. He was a teacher. He was supposed to be trustworthy. I thought he was in love with me." She looked directly at Amara. "It took me years of therapy to understand that what happened to me was rape. It took me years to understand that he had manipulated me. It took me years to understand that I wasn't special. I was just another victim." Amara asked Keisha for permission to record her story. Keisha agreed, on the condition that her name not be used in any articles until the legal case was resolved. "I have nightmares," Keisha told Amara. "I have trouble trusting people. I've had 2 failed relationships because I couldn't be intimate with anyone. I go to therapy twice a week. I take medication for depression and anxiety. And for 9 years, I thought it was my fault. I thought I had done something to make him think I wanted it." The second victim was named Maria Gonzalez. She was 22 years old and currently in college studying education. Ironically, because she wanted to be the kind of teacher she wished she had had. Maria had been assaulted 3 years earlier, when she was 19 years old. "I reported it," Maria told Amara when they met at a coffee shop near her university campus. "I told the school exactly what happened. I described the date and the time and what he did to me, and the school investigated it. But they said there wasn't enough evidence. They said it was my word against his, and because he denied it, they couldn't do anything. Maria's anger was palpable. But what they didn't say was that he had done the exact same thing to at least 6 other girls. What they didn't say was that they knew this about him because they had investigated him before. What they didn't say was that they made a choice to protect him instead of protecting us. The third victim was named Jasmine Rodriguez. She was 19 years old and had attempted suicide twice since her assault. "I don't know why I'm even talking to you," Jasmine said when they met at her apartment, "because even if you write about this, even if you expose him, what will happen? He'll be fired. He'll move to another school district and start all over again, or he'll sue you for defamation and destroy your life." But despite her skepticism, Jasmine agreed to share her story. "I was so stupid," Jasmine said. "I thought he cared about me. I thought he saw something special in me. I didn't realize that he was targeting me because I was vulnerable. My parents were going through a divorce. I was sad and lonely, and he took advantage of that." She paused. "The worst part isn't what he did to me physically. The worst part is that the school knew. The school had investigated him before. The school had him reported to them, and they did nothing. They protected him. Which means it's their fault too. All of it is their fault for not stopping him when they could have." Amara found the other victims as well. Each one had a similar story. Each one had reported the assault to the school. Each one had been told there wasn't enough evidence. Each one had spent years trying to heal from trauma that the school had allowed to happen. There was David Chen, now 28, who'd been assaulted when he was 16 and whose case had been classified as inconclusive by the school. There was Marcus Thompson, now 26, whose family had been threatened with legal action when they tried to report the assault to the police. There was Lisa Park, now 24, who had attempted suicide after being assaulted and whose assault had been covered up by the school. Each victim told a similar story: grooming, assault, trauma, and then institutional failure. As Amara reviewed all the cases, a disturbing pattern emerged. All of the victims had one thing in common. They all came from single-parent households where the mother was working full-time and had limited availability. They were all vulnerable. They were all seeking male attention and approval. They were all exactly the type of child that a predator like James Thomas would target. And the school knew this, because when Amara dug deeper into the school's records, she found internal memos discussing the complaints. Memos written by the assistant principal, Gerald Morrison, and the school counselor, Dr. Patricia Graves, that noted that the victims had family situations that might make them prone to fantasy, and that students from broken homes sometimes develop inappropriate attachments to authority figures. One memo stated, while the student claims inappropriate contact occurred, her family situation makes her susceptibility to misinterpretation noteworthy. Students without father figures in the home often project emotions onto male authority figures. Another memo noted, the complainant's socioeconomic status and family circumstances may have contributed to the accusation. Students in financial distress sometimes develop inappropriate attachments. The school had essentially blamed the victims for being vulnerable. The school had essentially said that if you came from a poor family with a single mother, you were more likely to be a liar. The school had used the victim's vulnerability as evidence against them rather than as evidence of predatory targeting. Amara also discovered something else that made her blood boil. James Thomas had been investigated by law enforcement multiple times. 2 different police departments had investigated him over the years, but both investigations had been closed without charges being filed. Both times, the reason given was insufficient evidence. But when Amara dug deeper into those police investigations, she found something interesting. The lead detective on the first case had a daughter who had been a student at the school. The second detective had gone to high school with Principal David Harrison, and they had remained friends. These weren't huge connections, but they were connections nonetheless. Amara began to suspect that the local police department might have been protecting James Thomas for reasons that had nothing to do with justice. Amara decided that she needed to go beyond the victims that James Thomas had assaulted at the school. She needed to find out if he had assaulted students before he became a teacher. She requested his employment records from every job he had ever held. What she found was remarkable. James Thomas had been a tutor before he became a teacher. He had worked for 3 different tutoring services over a 5-year period, and he had been fired from all 3 of them. The reasons for termination in the official records were vague. Terminated for performance issues. Terminated due to student complaints. Terminated for violating company policy. But when Amara tracked down former supervisors from those tutoring services, she got a different story. "We fired him because a student reported that he had touched her inappropriately during a tutoring session," said Margaret Chen, a former supervisor at Academic Excellence Tutoring Services. "We reported it to the police, but nothing came of it. Then he applied to become a teacher, and I assumed the school had done a proper background check and knew what they were dealing with. The school had not done a proper background check, or rather, they had done one, but they had chosen to interpret the information in a way that was favorable to James Thomas. Terminated for performance issues doesn't automatically raise a red flag about sexual misconduct, but if you call the previous employer and ask why, you find out the truth. The school hadn't called. Amara also discovered that James Thomas had dated a woman named Rebecca Harris in his 20s. Rebecca agreed to an interview. "He became obsessed with me," Rebecca said. "When I tried to break up with him, he became abusive. He would follow me. He would call me constantly. He would show up at places where I was. When I finally got a restraining order against him, he pretended to accept it, but he continued to violate it. The police finally arrested him, but he got a good lawyer and the charges were dropped." Amara found newspaper records of the arrest. On September 15, 1989, James Thomas had been arrested for violation of a restraining order. The charges had been dropped 2 months later. There was a pattern going back decades. James Thomas had always targeted vulnerable people. He had always been protected when he was caught. Amara met with a criminal defense attorney named Marcus Williams to discuss her options. Marcus was a man in his 50s who specialized in defending people accused of crimes, but who also understood that his clients sometimes needed to be held accountable for what they had done. He was brilliant and strategic and understood that the legal system was often broken in ways that protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. "You have a very strong case against the school," Marcus said, spreading documents across his desk. "You have evidence that they knew James Thomas had a history of inappropriate behavior with students. You have evidence that they investigated him multiple times and chose not to take action. You have evidence that they failed in their duty to protect students." "What about James Thomas?" Amara asked. "What about criminal charges?" "That's more complicated," Marcus said. "The statute of limitations on some of these cases has expired, and many of the cases rely heavily on the testimony of young women who are now adults, and whose memories may have become less clear over the years. A good defense attorney could create reasonable doubt." He paused. "But a civil lawsuit is a different story. In civil court, you don't need to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. You need to prove it by a preponderance of the evidence. And you have that. You have multiple victims. You have documentation showing the school knew about his behavior. You have evidence of a pattern." "What would a lawsuit accomplish?" Amara asked. "Money," Marcus said, "which is what the school cares about. Hit them in the wallet hard enough and they'll remove him. They'll try to cover it up, but they'll remove him." "But he'll just move to another school," Amara said. "He'll just find more victims somewhere else." "Yes," Marcus said, "unless you also go public." Amara began her article on a Tuesday morning in November. She had been a journalist for 20 years. She had won awards for her investigative work. She had exposed corruption at the municipal level. She had brought down city officials who had embezzled public funds. She had investigated police brutality and brought reform to her city's police department. But this felt different. This was personal. She began by compiling everything she had learned about James Thomas. She created a timeline showing the progression of complaints over 15 years. She documented each assault allegation. She included the school's response to each allegation. She showed the pattern. She researched his employment history before becoming a teacher. She documented his dismissals from tutoring companies. She included statements from former supervisors. She documented his history of relationship abuse. She obtained police records of his previous arrest. She documented his connections to police detectives and school administrators. She interviewed child psychology experts who explained how predators target vulnerable children and how institutions often protect perpetrators. She interviewed victim advocates who explained the trauma of institutional abuse. She spent 3 weeks writing and rewriting. She verified every fact. She contacted every witness. She obtained documents. She reviewed police reports. She examined school records. She interviewed victims. Her article was 35 pages long. It was comprehensive and devastating. She titled it, "The System Failed Us: How Lincoln High School Protected a Sexual Predator for 15 Years." She included the names of all 7 victims, with their permission. She included direct quotes from school memos blaming victims for being vulnerable. She included timelines showing the pattern of complaints and the school's response, or lack thereof. She included interviews with former supervisors from the tutoring companies that had fired him. She included details about the police investigations that seemed to have connections to the school. She included statements from child protection experts about how predators typically operate and how institutions often protect them. She included a call for reform at the state level regarding background checks and the statute of limitations. She included photographs of the school, the classroom where the assaults occurred, and the office where complaints had been filed. Her newspaper's legal team reviewed it carefully. They verified every single fact. They contacted James Thomas and the school for comment. They gave them every opportunity to respond. James Thomas refused to comment. His lawyer sent a threatening letter warning that any publication would result in defamation lawsuits. Principal Harrison's response was to say that the school takes all allegations seriously and investigates them thoroughly, which was technically true, but failed to mention that the school had chosen not to act on the findings of those investigations. The school's lawyer also sent a threatening letter, warning of legal action. But the newspaper's legal team had done their work. Everything in the article was factually accurate. Everything was either a direct quote or a verifiable fact. The article could not be successfully sued for defamation. The article was published on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, the article was trending on social media. By Saturday morning, news outlets across the country were picking up the story. By Sunday, James Thomas's name was nationwide. The social media response was immediate and visceral. Parents called for James Thomas's removal. Teachers called for an investigation into Principal Harrison's handling of the complaints. The school board was forced to hold an emergency meeting. The local news ran segments about the case. National news outlets picked up the story. Online activists demanded justice. Alumni of the school began sharing their own stories of inappropriate behavior by teachers. People around the country began talking about their own experiences with institutional protection of predators. The article had touched a nerve. At the emergency school board meeting, they announced that James Thomas had been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. 2 days later, James Thomas resigned from his position. But by then, it was too late to avoid the criminal investigation that had been triggered by Amara's article. The district attorney's office, faced with overwhelming public pressure and clear evidence of a pattern of behavior, opened a new investigation into James Thomas. This time, the detective in charge was a woman named Sarah Martinez, who had no connection to the school and had a reputation for meticulous investigation. This time, the investigation was conducted with the full authority of the district attorney's office behind it. And this time, witnesses who had been reluctant to speak to police before were willing to speak now, because Amara's article had given them courage. They saw that others had come forward. They saw that the system was finally listening. They saw that justice might actually be possible. Detective Sarah Martinez was different from Detective Robert Chen. Where Detective Chen had seemed disinterested and lazy, Detective Martinez was thorough and relentless. She interviewed all 7 victims in person, conducting detailed interviews that took hours each. She listened carefully to every word they said. She took photographs of bruises that still existed. She obtained medical records from each victim. She documented the timeline of each assault. She obtained medical records from Simone's hospitalization that documented physical evidence consistent with sexual assault. A medical examiner's report noted injuries consistent with sexual trauma. She subpoenaed school records and emails. She obtained communications between James Thomas and other teachers. She reviewed the school's internal investigation files. What she found in those communications was shocking. James Thomas had written emails to another teacher named Richard Sanders discussing Simone and the other victims as if they were conquests. In one email, he wrote, "Got another one today." She was reluctant at first, but came around. "These lonely kids are so easy." In another email, he wrote, "The Martinez girl has the best body. Can't wait to get another opportunity with her." He had even invited Richard Sanders to join him in assaulting one of the victims. In one email, he wrote, "If you ever want to try one of my girls, let me know. I could introduce you to a couple who would be game. They're scared to say no." Richard Sanders had responded, "That's messed up but tempting. Let me think about it." Detective Martinez also discovered that James Thomas had taken photographs of some of his victims without their knowledge. She found a hidden folder on his computer containing explicit photographs of minors. Some of the photographs were of students at Lincoln High School. The evidence was overwhelming. 6 months after Amara's article was published, James Thomas was arrested on 12 counts of sexual assault. 12 counts spanning 15 years and 7 different victims. Richard Sanders was also arrested as a co-conspirator. Both men were denied bail due to the severity of the charges. The trial lasted 3 months. The courtroom was packed every day. Other journalists covered the trial extensively. Parents from the school attended. Advocates for sexual assault victims attended. Supporters of the victims attended. The prosecutor, a brilliant woman named Jennifer Martinez, no relation to the detective, methodically presented the evidence. She presented the medical records documenting the physical trauma. She presented the photographs found on James Thomas's computer. She presented the emails between James Thomas and Richard Sanders. She presented the school records showing the previous complaints. She presented testimony from the child psychology expert about how predators operate and how they target vulnerable children. She presented testimony from the victims' therapists about the lasting trauma of sexual assault. One by one, the 7 victims took the stand. Each one testified about the grooming process. Each one described how James Thomas had targeted them because they were vulnerable. Each one talked about the manipulation. Each one talked about the assault itself. It was difficult testimony. Several of the victims became emotional while testifying. Some needed to take breaks, some needed water, but each one finished their testimony. Keisha testified about how she had believed it was a real relationship and had taken years to understand that it was rape. Maria testified about reporting the assault to the school and being told there wasn't enough evidence, knowing all the while that the school had protected him from other victims. Jasmine testified about her suicide attempts and the ongoing trauma. Simone testified about the fear and the violation and the way her entire world had been turned upside down. The jury listened to every word. For each victim, testifying was re-traumatizing, but it was also, for some, cathartic. It was the first time they had been believed. It was the first time the system had taken their allegations seriously. It was the first time they had been able to speak the truth in a courtroom where justice might actually be served. James Thomas's defense attorney was skilled. He was experienced in defending sexual assault cases. He knew all the tactics for creating reasonable doubt. He tried to portray the victims as unreliable. He suggested that they had misinterpreted innocent actions as sexual assault. He tried to create confusion about the timeline of events. He tried to suggest that the victims had motivation based on money from a potential civil lawsuit. But the physical evidence was clear. Medical records from Simone's hospitalization documented trauma consistent with sexual assault. Emails from James Thomas documented his intent and his consciousness of guilt. Text messages from victims to friends immediately after the assault documented their distress. The photographs he had taken without their knowledge documented his predatory behavior. The testimony of 7 victims was consistent and compelling. There was no reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, they returned a verdict: guilty on 11 of the 12 counts. The courtroom erupted. The victims' families embraced each other. Amara held her daughter's hand. The judge was Margaret Chen, a woman in her 60s who had spent her entire career protecting vulnerable people. When she sentenced James Thomas, her words were powerful and direct. "You are a predator," Judge Chen said from the bench. "You have systematically exploited vulnerable children. You have abused a position of trust. You have damaged 7 young women in ways that will last for the rest of their lives." She paused, looking directly at James Thomas. "You hid behind the authority that society granted you. You used that authority to manipulate children. You relied on institutions failing to protect those children. You bet that the system would protect you rather than protect them." Judge Chen's voice grew harder. "You were right. For 15 years, the system did protect you, but that has ended. Now you will spend the rest of your life in prison, and you will have the rest of your life to think about the harm you caused." The sentence was 73 years in federal prison. James Thomas screamed as he was led away. He claimed it was a setup. He claimed he was being persecuted. He claimed he was innocent. But the jury had found him guilty. The judge had sentenced him. And now he would spend the rest of his life in prison. As for Richard Sanders, he negotiated a plea deal. He agreed to testify against James Thomas in exchange for a reduced sentence. He received 20 years in federal prison. The civil lawsuit against the school moved forward after James Thomas's conviction. The school's insurance company and the school's legal team fought hard. They argued that the school had followed proper procedures. They argued that the investigations had been thorough. They argued that the school had no way of knowing that James Thomas would commit these crimes. But they had known. The evidence was irrefutable. The school had investigated complaints against James Thomas multiple times. The school had found evidence of inappropriate behavior. The school had chosen not to take action. The school had protected him while he continued to assault students. That was negligence. That was a failure to protect. That was institutional corruption. The trial lasted 2 months. Amara's lawyer presented evidence showing that the school knew about James Thomas's history. The school had received complaints. The school had investigated. The school had documented the complaints. The school had concluded that something had happened, but had chosen to protect the teacher instead of the students. The school's lawyer argued that without definitive proof of criminal conduct, they had no legal obligation to remove him. But the jury wasn't persuaded by that argument. The jury understood that the school's first obligation was to protect children. The jury understood that the school had known about the pattern of complaints. The jury understood that the school had had opportunities to stop James Thomas and had chosen not to. After deliberating for 3 days, the jury returned a verdict. The school was liable. The jury awarded damages of $4.7 million to the victims. Simone was awarded $1.2 million for her suffering. Principal David Harrison was fired from his position immediately after the civil verdict. The assistant principal who had written the memo blaming victims was fired. The school counselor who had participated in the cover-up was fired. The school launched an immediate overhaul of its policies and procedures. New policies were implemented. All allegations of sexual misconduct were to be reported immediately to law enforcement. All previous employers were to be contacted during the background check process. All complaints, even those deemed unsubstantiated, were to be kept in a central file. Victims were to be informed of the outcome of all investigations. No teacher with a history of complaints was to be retained. The State Department of Education launched a statewide investigation into teacher misconduct. Other schools in the district began reviewing their own investigations into teacher conduct. Amara's article had triggered a reckoning throughout the entire school system. Amara realized that her work wasn't done. She published a second article about the other victims whose cases had expired under the statute of limitations. She wrote about Keisha, who had been assaulted 9 years earlier and whose case could not be prosecuted because too much time had passed. She wrote about the failures of the statute of limitations in protecting children. She wrote about how predators like James Thomas relied on the statute of limitations to ensure that older victims couldn't prosecute them. She wrote, "These victims waited years before they were able to talk about what happened. They struggled with shame and trauma. They weren't ready to come forward. And by the time they were ready, the law said it was too late. The system that should protect victims had instead protected the predator by allowing his crimes to expire." Her article created a groundswell of public support for changing the statute of limitations laws in her state. Amara testified before the legislature about her daughter's experience and about the other victims. She said, "The statute of limitations doesn't protect innocent people. It protects predators. It tells them that if they can keep their victims silent for long enough, they will never face justice. We need to change this law. We need to tell predators that we will not let them hide behind the statute of limitations." She brought Keisha and Maria and Jasmine to testify as well. Keisha said, "I spent 9 years not talking about what happened. I spent 9 years thinking it was my fault. I spent 9 years in therapy trying to heal. And when I finally was ready to come forward, I was told it was too late. The law didn't care about my trauma. The law only cared about protecting the predator." Maria said, "I reported it when I was ready to report it. I told the truth. And the school protected the teacher instead of supporting me. But now I understand that even if the school had done the right thing, the statute of limitations would have prevented criminal prosecution. The law itself is broken." Jasmine said, "I tried to kill myself because of what he did to me. I almost didn't survive, and the law would have told him that he was safe. That's not justice. That's not protecting victims. That's protecting predators." Their testimony was powerful and moving. The legislators heard directly from victims about how the statute of limitations had prevented them from getting justice. They heard about the lasting trauma. They heard about how the system had failed them. The legislature voted to eliminate the statute of limitations for sexual assault crimes involving minors. The vote was nearly unanimous. Even the most conservative legislators understood that protecting children from predators was more important than limiting lawsuits against schools and institutions. It was the first time in the state's history that such a law had been passed, and it happened because Amara Jackson had refused to accept that the system couldn't be changed. After the trial and the legislative victory, Amara founded an organization called The Silent Scream. The organization was dedicated to helping victims of sexual assault brought by authority figures. It provided free legal representation to victims whose cases had fallen through the cracks of the legal system. It provided funding for investigations. It provided support groups and therapy resources. It also worked to change laws and policies that protected perpetrators at the expense of victims. The organization's first case, after Simone's, was Keisha's. Using the new statute of limitations law, Amara's legal team filed a new prosecution against James Thomas for Keisha's assault. He was convicted and received an additional 15 years in federal prison. Within 5 years, the Silent Scream had helped over 200 victims bring civil lawsuits against schools and other institutions. The organization had recovered over $50 million in settlements. money that went directly to victims. Within 10 years, that number had grown to nearly 500 victims. Many of those lawsuits had resulted in settlements that forced institutions to implement new policies and procedures to protect children. Schools throughout the country began implementing the changes that Lincoln High School had been forced to implement. Other institutions, athletic organizations, religious institutions, youth organizations began implementing similar changes. The ripple effect of Amara's initial investigation had spread throughout the entire country. Simone took a year off from school after the trial. She went to therapy multiple times a week. She worked with a trauma specialist named Dr. David Wong, who specialized in treating victims of sexual assault and institutional abuse. Slowly, over months, she began to rebuild her sense of safety and her sense of self. The civil settlement money was placed in a trust fund for Simone. The school's insurance company paid $1.2 million directly to her as compensation for her suffering. But money couldn't undo what had been done to her. Money couldn't erase the violation. Money couldn't make her feel safe again. What helped was time and therapy, and the knowledge that her mother had fought for her, that her mother had refused to accept the school's explanation, that her mother had exposed the truth and forced the system to respond, that her mother had changed laws that would protect other children. A year after the trial, Simone returned to school. She finished her final years of high school while continuing therapy. Her grades suffered that year. She struggled emotionally, but she persisted. She applied to universities again. She was accepted to Yale, Stanford, and Harvard. She chose Harvard. At Harvard, she began studying criminal justice and policy. She became interested in reforming laws that protected victims and held institutions accountable. She became interested in the same work that her mother was doing. During her second year at Harvard, Simone wrote a thesis about institutional sexual abuse and the failure of schools to protect children. The thesis was titled "The Silent Scream: How Institutions Protect Predators and Fail Victims." The thesis was so compelling that it was published in a legal journal and cited by lawyers working on cases against schools and other institutions. After graduating from Harvard with honors in criminal justice and policy, Simone attended law school at Columbia University. She specialized in victims' rights and institutional accountability. She graduated top of her class and immediately joined the Silent Scream organization as a lawyer. She became the organization's legal director. Mother and daughter worked together to change the system that had failed them. 20 years after James Thomas's conviction, Amara stood in front of the school that had failed to protect her daughter. The school had undergone massive changes in the 2 decades since the scandal. It had hired new administrators. It had implemented new policies. It had become one of the safest schools in the state. But that only happened because Amara had forced the issue. That only happened because Amara had refused to accept the school's explanation. That only happened because Amara had used the tools of investigative journalism to expose the truth. Simone stood beside her mother. She was now a lawyer specializing in institutional accountability and child protection. She worked for the same organization that her mother had founded. Together, they had changed the lives of hundreds of victims. They had forced institutions to become accountable. They had changed laws that protected victims. They had created a legacy of justice that extended far beyond their own family. The moral of this story is profound. Sometimes, when the system fails you, you have to become the system. Sometimes, when institutions refuse to protect the vulnerable, you have to expose those institutions and force them to change. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon against corruption is the truth. Amara Jackson could have accepted the school's explanation. She could have accepted that her daughter had no recourse. She could have accepted that James Thomas would never face justice. Instead, she used her skills as an investigative journalist to expose what had happened. She interviewed victims. She obtained records. She documented a pattern of abuse that spanned 15 years. She forced the system to respond not through legal arguments, but through the power of public truth. And in doing so, she didn't just get justice for her daughter. She got justice for 7 victims. She changed laws that protected children. She forced an institution to become accountable for its failures. She created an organization that has helped nearly 500 victims. All of that happened because one mother refused to accept that her daughter didn't matter. All of that happened because one mother used her talents and her voice to expose the truth. All of that happened because Amara Jackson understood that sometimes the most powerful form of justice is simply telling the truth so loudly and so completely that the system has no choice but to respond. James Thomas died in federal prison at the age of 78. He had served 25 years of his 73-year sentence before his death from a heart attack while incarcerated. He died alone, forgotten, irrelevant. His legacy was the 7 women whose lives he had damaged. But it was also the 500 victims who had been helped by the silent scream. It was also the hundreds of children whose schools had changed their policies because of his crimes. It was also the thousands of people whose lives had been improved because the statute of limitations for sexual assault had been eliminated. His crimes had inadvertently created change. And while that didn't undo what he had done, it did ensure that his victims had not suffered in vain. This story demonstrates several profound truths. First, institutions will protect their own over vulnerable people unless forced to do otherwise. The school knew about James Thomas. The school had investigated him multiple times. The school chose to protect him because his removal would have been an admission of institutional failure. Second, predators are often protected for decades because they target vulnerable people whose voices are less likely to be believed or heard. James Thomas specifically targeted children from single-parent households because he knew they were more vulnerable and less likely to have strong support systems. Third, the system is designed to protect powerful people, not vulnerable people. The police department's failure to investigate was not accidental. It was institutional. The school's protection of the teacher was not accidental. It was institutional. These failures happened because the system prioritizes institutions over individuals. Fourth, one person with courage and resources can change everything. Amara had skills. She was a journalist with access to public records, experience conducting investigations, and the credibility to be published. Not every victim has these resources, but what Amara did was use what she had to expose the truth. And that exposure forced change. Fifth, the truth is the most powerful weapon against corruption. Amara didn't need to win in court first to force change. She published the truth, and the truth forced the system to respond. Public shame and public pressure are often more effective than legal arguments.